36 logical fallacies explained now. Let's go. Ad hominem fallacy. This error occurs when, instead of addressing the substance of an argument, the speaker attacks the personal characteristics, character, circumstances, or other irrelevant aspects of the person making the argument. For example, in a debate about economic policy, rather than analyzing the policy's strengths and weaknesses, someone might say, "We don't need to listen to Mr. A's opinion because everyone knows he has had personal financial management problems." Clearly, whether Mr. A has personal issues does not automatically make his economic policy arguments right or wrong. Strawman fallacy. This occurs when a speaker intentionally distorts, misrepresents, or oversimplifies an opponent's argument into a different, weaker, and more easily attacked version. They then attack this straw man instead of addressing the original argument. For instance, if someone suggests we should consider reducing working hours to increase productivity and work-life balance for employees, another person might commit this fallacy by retorting, "So you want everyone to be lazy, work less, and then the company goes bankrupt." This clearly distorts the original suggestion into an unrealistic negative scenario. Circular reasoning, begging the question. This type of fallacy uses the conclusion itself as a premise to prove that conclusion, creating a non-starting loop. For example, someone might say, "This book contains only reliable information because its author is a very trustworthy person." We know the author is trustworthy because everything he writes in the book is true. This argument provides no independent evidence to verify the book's reliability or the author's trustworthiness. Hasty generalization. This error occurs when a speaker draws a general conclusion based on too little evidence or from a sample that is not representative enough of the entire group. For example, if a tourist visits a city and unfortunately encounters two dishonest taxi drivers, and then concludes, "All taxi drivers in this city are scammers," that is a hasty generalization, because personal experience with two individuals cannot represent an entire large group. Appeal to popularity, argumentum ad populum, bandwagon fallacy. This fallacy argues that something is true, good, or should be accepted simply because many people believe in it or do it. For example, an advertisement might claim, "Millions of people have trusted product X, so it must be the best product for you." However, the popularity of a product or idea does not automatically guarantee its truthfulness or quality. Appeal to authority, argumentum ad verecundiam. This occurs when a speaker cites the opinion of an authority figure or expert to assert that something is true, even if that person's expertise is not relevant to the topic at hand, or when there are other expert opinions to the contrary. For example, a famous actor, with no medical expertise, endorsing and claiming a dietary supplement can cure serious diseases is a typical case. Listeners should consider scientific evidence rather than just the spokesperson's fame. False dilemma, false dichotomy. The user of this fallacy deliberately presents only two options as if they are the only possibilities, when in reality, more options or nuanced solutions may exist. For instance, a manager might tell an employee, "Either you accept working overtime without pay, or you can find another job." This framing forces the listener into a narrow choice, ignoring other solutions like negotiation, workload adjustment, or reviewing company policy. Slippery slope fallacy. This argument claims that an initial action A, often minor, will inevitably lead to a chain of negative consequences, B, C, D, etc., without sufficient evidence to prove such a strong causal link. For example, someone might oppose allowing students to use tablets in class by arguing, "If we let students use tablets, they will play games. Then they won't focus on studying. Their results will decline, and ultimately, an entire generation will be ruined." This argument presents an overly negative and unsubstantiated scenario. Correlation-causation fallacy. This is a reasoning error that assumes because two events occur together, or one after the other, one must be the cause of the other. For example, if statistics show that cities with more ice cream shops also have higher crime rates, one might hastily conclude that ice cream causes crime. However, a third factor, such as hot weather, might be a common cause for both increased ice cream consumption and higher crime rates. Appeal to emotion. Instead of providing logical reasoning and evidence, the speaker attempts to persuade others by evoking strong emotions such as fear, pity, anger, or pride. For instance, a fundraising campaign might focus on heartbreaking images of victims to stir compassion, rather than clearly presenting how the donations will be used and their effectiveness. While emotions are important, decisions based solely on emotion, ignoring reason, can lead to errors. To quoque, you too fallacy. This is a form of ad hominem in which a person deflects criticism by accusing the critic of the same error or of being a hypocrite. For example, when reminded about not adhering to company regulations, an employee might retort to their manager, "You've been late yourself sometimes." Whether the manager has been late does not make the employee's violation of regulations correct. Sunk cost fallacy. This error occurs when people continue to invest time, money, or effort into something that is no longer effective or promising simply because they have already invested significant resources in it. For example, someone might continue watching a very bad movie to the end just because they paid for the ticket and watched the first half, instead of accepting the loss of time and leaving. Decisions should be based on future benefits and costs, not on what has already been irretrievably lost. Argument from ignorance, argumentum ad ignorantium. This argument asserts that something is true because it has not been proven false, or conversely that something is false because it has not been proven true. For example, no one has proven that aliens do not exist, so they must exist. The absence of evidence is not evidence of presence or absence. Genetic fallacy. This involves judging an idea, theory, or product as good or bad based on its origin or source, rather than on its own merits. For example, don't trust that idea. It came from a rival company. The origin or creator of an idea does not necessarily determine its validity or usefulness. No true Scotsman fallacy. This is a way a person attempts to protect a general claim from being refuted by an exception by arbitrarily changing the definition of the group to exclude the counterexample. For example, A says, "All good software developers prefer working at night." B replies, "I'm a good software developer and I prefer working during the day." A then retorts, "Well, then you're not a true good software developer." Appeal to nature. Argumentum ad naturam. This argues that something is good because it is natural, or bad because it is unnatural. For example, this food product is all organic and natural, so it's definitely healthier than genetically modified foods. However, natural does not always mean good, and artificial does not always mean bad. Burden of proof fallacy, shifting the burden of proof. This occurs when someone making a claim puts the burden on another person to disprove their claim, rather than providing evidence to support their own claim. For example, a person states, "I believe there's an invisible dragon living in my garage." When asked for proof, they reply, "Well, you prove that there isn't one." Red herring, missing the point. Ignoratio elenchi. The speaker introduces irrelevant information or a new topic to divert attention from the main issue being discussed. For example, when asked about their responsibility for a failed project, a manager might start talking about the general difficulties of the market or unrelated minor successes to make the audience forget the original question. Weak analogy, false analogy. This involves using an analogy between two things or phenomena that are not actually similar in relevant aspects to draw a conclusion. For example, banning students from bringing smartphones to school is like banning carpenters from bringing hammers to work. They are both essential tools. The similarity between students' smartphones and carpenters' hammers is very weak and inappropriate for such a conclusion. Argument from silence. Argumentum ex silentio. A conclusion is drawn based on the absence of evidence or the silence of a source, assuming that if something were true, it would have been recorded. For example, no historical documents record King X ever laughing, so he must have been a person who never laughed. The silence of history does not necessarily prove the negative. Complex question, loaded question. This involves asking a question that contains an implicit, unproven, or unaccepted assumption, such that any way the respondent answers, they appear to endorse that assumption. For example, have you stopped cheating on exams? Whether the answer is yes or no, the person implicitly admits to having cheated in the past. Suppressed evidence, cherry-picking. This involves presenting only evidence or data that supports one's own viewpoint, while intentionally ignoring or concealing evidence or data that does not support or contradicts it. For example, a company advertising a weight loss drug might only show successful cases while ignoring the majority of people who saw no effect or experienced side effects. Equivocation. This involves using a word or phrase with multiple meanings in the same argument in a way that causes confusion, making the argument seem valid when it is not. For example, the law states everyone has a right to liberty. Therefore, I have the liberty to drive over the speed limit. Here, liberty in a legal sense and liberty as personal freedom to do anything are used with different meanings. Amphiboly. An argument becomes fallacious because the grammatical structure of a sentence makes it ambiguous and open to multiple interpretations. For example, last night I shot an elephant in my pajamas. How an elephant got into my pajamas, I'll never know. The sentence is ambiguous about who or what was in the pajamas. Fallacy of composition. This assumes that what is true of individual parts must also be true of the whole made up of those parts. For example, every player on this basketball team is a star, so this will definitely be an unbeatable team. A collection of excellent individuals does not guarantee that the collective will function effectively as a unified whole. Fallacy of division. The opposite of the fallacy of composition, this assumes that what is true of the whole must also be true of its individual parts. For example, this machine is very heavy, so all of its components must also be very heavy. The machine might be composed of many small, light parts. Moving the goalposts. This involves changing the criteria or requirements of an argument or a challenge after the opponent has already met the initial criteria, in order to avoid admitting defeat or to maintain one's position. For example, after a scientific theory meets empirical evidence A, B, and C, an opponent then demands additional evidence D, E, and F that was not originally set forth. Special pleading. This involves making an exception for one's own case without a justifiable reason, while still applying the standard to others. For example, I know everyone is supposed to turn off their phones during the meeting, but my situation is an emergency, even if it's not truly urgent. So, I'm allowed. Gambler's fallacy. This is the belief that past random events influence the probability of future random events, when in reality these events are independent. For example, after flipping a coin and getting heads 5 times in a row, someone believes the next flip is more likely to be tails to balance things out. Middle ground fallacy. Argument to moderation. This assumes that a compromise or middle point between two extreme positions is always the correct or best one. simply because it is the middle ground. For example, if one person says the Earth is flat and another says the Earth is spherical, this fallacy might suggest the truth is that the Earth is somewhat oval-shaped, simply by virtue of being a compromise. The truth is not always found in the middle of two extremes. Appeal to consequences. Argumentum ad consequentiam. This involves judging a proposition to be true or false based on whether accepting it would lead to desirable or undesirable consequences. For example, evolutionary theory cannot be true because if it were, humans would have no special place in the universe, which would be too depressing. Feelings about the consequences do not determine the truth of a proposition. Appeal to force. Argumentum ad baculum. This involves using threats, pressure, or force, or the implication of them, to compel someone to accept a conclusion. For example, if you don't agree with this proposal, you will face serious consequences in your job. Appeal to novelty. Argumentum ad novitatem. This assumes that an idea, product, or method is better or more correct simply because it is new. For example, this new project management software is definitely more effective than the old version because it was just released. Appeal to tradition. Argumentum ad antiquitatem. The opposite of the appeal to novelty, this assumes that an idea, custom, or method is better or more correct simply because it is old and traditional. For example, we've always done it this way for generations, so there's no reason to change it. Texas sharpshooter fallacy. This involves selecting or emphasizing similarities in data retrospectively after events have occurred, and then creating a hypothesis based on those similarities, like a sharpshooter firing at a barn wall and then drawing a target around the bullet holes. For example, finding random commonalities among victims of a rare disease and then declaring that as the cause, without a controlled, pre-planned study. Fallacy of the single cause, causal oversimplification. This assumes that a complex event has only one single cause, when in reality it is the result of multiple interacting factors. For example, that company failed because of its incompetent CEO. The failure of a company is often due to many more complex reasons than just one individual. If you like this content, please like, share, and subscribe, with the bell, for more from Full Chapter.